Welcome, dear viewers, to this interview with Mike Cassidy, the founder of African Enterprise, an evangelistic movement. Mike is an evangelist, a Christian statesman, not just in South Africa, but around the continent and known around the world. Mike has just come out with a biography, which is called Footprints in the African Sand. Like I said in the first part, very engaging, Mike. Like I said outside of the camera, thank you for this labor of love. I think it takes a lot to put out a book like this, but as I read it, I was really, really blessed. I know I said, Mike, that we're going to talk about the 94 miracle. Maybe I would start by looking back at your life as an evangelist. What would you say is one very outstanding mission you did that you look back and you say, Chim, that particular evangelistic outreach stands out for me, and you tell me why it stood out for you?
You know, I think maybe Johannesburg, we did one mission with 300 churches participating.
Which year was this?
That was 1970. That's a long time ago. Of course, there have been lots and lots of things since then. But that also involved efforts particularly to go and to reach to leadership. And so there were some good repercussions which came out from that and flowed out from that. I think the same sort of thing happened, for example, with our mission to Nairobi in 1968, 69. And we had access, to very senior people while we were evangelizing the masses. And when those two things are happening, I think you've got a mission that is really effective, and it will bring forth results and will go on for a long time.
You've always carried those two things, it seems, in your ministry, reaching out to the masses, but at the same time engaging leadership, which made your involvement in the whole change from apartheid to a free South Africa very interesting. You seem to have had your hands on the pulse of the nation. Tell us a bit about how you found yourself in the center of everything during this very interesting period of South African history.
Well, because we had a history of being interested in leadership, it was inevitable when we began to move towards elections in 1994 that we would have a real concern about it, because this was about leaders. It was about a conflict between leaders, and sometimes it spilling over into violence, like here in KwaZulu-Natal. You couldn't look at the run up to the 94 elections and realize that we were not talking about issues of leadership. It wasn't just masses. This involved very senior people. F.W. de Klerk, for example,
Who was the president,
and coming to the place of feeling that he had to release Dr. Mandela from prison, and he had to unban the liberation movements. He had to take the army out of the townships. Those were all of things which we went to President Botha about. In fact, I went personally to Botha to make this call, and had a very, very difficult confrontation with Botha in saying that this is what we were asking for. But we realized that unless there was some major concession from the South African side, of the leadership side, the white leadership, that we weren't going to come through without a cataclysm. But there was a particular problem in Natal, and that is that Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi and the Inkatha Freedom Party Zulus, they were very anxious about this whole, the new South Africa, what it was going to look like. because they had a fair degree of autonomy under the old apartheid Bantustan system, where KwaZulu-Natal pretty much ran itself, and ran itself quite well. Buthelezi decided to white ant the system from within by going into the Bantustan system, but then trying to use KwaZulu as a place to speak into the justice issue that South Africa needed a full adult franchise. You know, it needed equality of education and all of these things. So, but Buthelezi and the Inkatha Freedom Party Zulus, they feared that as we moved towards 1994 and the national elections, that we were moving towards a unitary state where all power would be centered in the central state, which would be primarily Xhosa and led by Mandela and other Xhosas. And he felt that in that happening, the federal power, which was fairly strongly held already in KwaZulu-Natal, would be lost. Mm-hmm. So a real tough issue came up with Buthelezi and Mandela. And it related to this: are we going to have a unitary state with all power centralized in a central government, or are we going to have a federal state where the different areas of South Africa would have a fair degree of political autonomy? And so they were saying before that election, unless you are going to give us some kind of local, not quite autonomous, but certainly strong federal authority in KwaZulu-Natal, we question this election. So this thing cooked up. I mean, it really cooked up, as you and others watching this program would remember.
Yeah.
And until you had the Mandela Zulus and the Buthelezi Zulus in real conflict.
And there were a lot of killings.
Oh, my word. In this area alone, there were 20 a day. At the weekends, about 60 or 70. And we opened up our newspaper and saw 10 people killed. We hardly even noticed it. In fact, it hardly made a headline, you know, until we realized, look, we are really sliding down the tube.
And everybody felt South Africa is going to end up in a genocide, in a civil war.
In a civil war.
In fact, you mentioned in your book that the BBC had withdrawn some of their reporters from Bosnia so as to be here to witness the next Bosnia.
Yeah.
And it was all settled and done that just a few weeks to elections, everything was going to go down the drain. But that's where I want you to recount the miracles that happened. Because in the book, I was, and I would want to again encourage those who are watching, and I know it looks as if I'm pushing a book, but I am pushing a book because if I see something good, I want to share it. But this is a good book. It's a good book in terms of capturing some of the things that God has done, not just in South Africa, but across the continent. I mentioned in passing your role in leadership, development. There's a lot we can learn from here. But the part about this miracle, when you started recounting how God stepped in, talk to us about the man from Kenya, Washington Okumu, how he got into the mix when he was initially not added among those who will be a part of the mediatory kind of arbitration group that was formed with high-level groups like Cassidy and others who came in. Tell us how he came into the mix.
Yes. Well, I had met Okumu in the UK at some private, off-the-record, fairly secret meetings about South Africa. He was an economist and a diplomat from Kenya. He'd studied under Kissinger at Harvard. He was a very smart fellow. And he knew quite a lot of the players in South Africa, like he had met de Klerk. He'd even known Forster before that. He knew Mandela and so on. And so we decided to bring him into the country and take him around to meet some of the key players. In '93, we had convened 6 weekends for politicians at a lodge called Kolobe, north of Pretoria. And we had about 96 or some politicians come for a series of 6 weekends with about 15 or 20, in each weekend. And in these weekends, relationships were established between people who were basically political enemies. And these relationships were established. Enemies became friends. The enemy was demythologized. The enemy was humanized. And at the end of '93, there was a terrific network of people who had come into relationship, not necessarily identical political agreement, but into relationship, and therefore could make some political headway together. Well, we thought it would be tremendous if some of these people that we had visited who never met each other could have a chance of meeting each other, and that's what happened in the Kolobe Lodge weekends. And then we wanted to bring Okumu in to meet some of these people, give him some of this network of friends and relationships, and so that was what happened. We took him to meet these various people until he had a tremendous grasp of the South African situation, because he was talking to all the people who never talked to each other, and that's very powerful. So, however, the situation began to deteriorate so seriously that Mandela and Buthelezi and de Klerk decided to bring in international mediators, led by Henry Kissinger, former U.S. Secretary of State, and Lord Carrington, former Secretary of State for UK. And they all got together on April the 14th. This is now 1994. We'd moved into '94, and things were deteriorating, going from bad to worse in the country. And there were only days left.
Before the election?
Before the election, days, less than 2 weeks. We were sinking. We were going down the tube. We were absolutely spiraling into catastrophe. We enabled Okumu to meet some of these key players. In fact, right here in this lounge, late one night, we had a meet with Mr. Dani Schutte, who was the Minister of the Interior in charge of the elections. And it was an extraordinary meeting. And Dani Schutte himself later said to me, that was for me when the miracle really began. Because he came here on election day and he said to me, we tried power, we tried politics, we tried money, we tried everything we knew how, and it all failed. But this little initiative where people had connected out of Kolobe and were now being able to connect via
Okumu.
Connect via Okumu, on the one hand to de Klerk and on the other hand to Mandela. And so Dani Schutte received information from Okumu that he'd got from Mandela or others, or he'd got from from Donnie Scritter and the people in government or de Klerk. And it was an amazing thing because a channel of communication started. And suffice it to say, the international mediation broke down after 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And it really broke down on this issue of federation versus unitary state, because Kissinger called for an alteration of the Constitution right before the elections. And so it all collapsed. Okumu called me and he said, you know, Kissinger's going home and says there'll be Armageddon here in 2 weeks' time. And everybody agreed. The State Department had told us from the US that they informally anticipated 1 million dead in Natal alone. And who knows what would have followed, probably still be fighting. However, he said that he was going to go home as well, and I said, no, you can't, because you're the key player here. You don't know these people. So in those last days, in the run-up to the elections, Okumu really worked hard with the different sides.
There's one aspect, just the point where you said he was going to go home, where you said he was, in the book you talked about Buthelezi had boarded a plane because he was going to go back and speak to Buthelezi.
Yeah.
Buthelezi had boarded a plane and was leaving. And the plane was stopped for some reasons, and the plane had to come back. And Okumu had a chance to speak to Buthelezi, and then it changed the message he was taking back to the king.
Yeah, it was really really amazing, because the plane turned back because of a malfunctioning compass, and turned back to Lanseria Airport. Buthelezi had missed seeing, Okumu had missed seeing Buthelezi there, but then they had to turn the plane back for mechanical reasons, and then they got to meet. And Okumu, who decided to stay on, we persuaded him. He said, oh, okay, I'll stay on. And he began to share some thoughts that he was having with Buthelezi. And Buthelezi was encouraged by this, and went back to the king with a different story. And what Okumu was coming up with was that there was so much at stake that you can't leave this federation and unitary issue to block and explode the whole democratic process and experience that South Africa was moving into. Mm-hmm. And what he was proposing then was that after the Inkatha Freedom Party come in on the elections at the last minute, but then after the elections, this issue would be discussed again with international mediation. And it was taken to Mandela and others and the ANC, and actually they agreed on that at the last minute.
I read that in the book, yeah, and for me, we read what the media had reported, but behind it was prayer. Behind it was the people of God.
Prayer.
It was around the time you ended up having the
day and night prayer for 2 years.
24/7 prayers, and then there was the Jesus Peace prayer rally that came just some days after that or around that time. And I see Christians who take responsibility for their country, who decide we're going to pray, but who also decide we're going to do what we can do to make a difference. And the way God made it possible for you to fly in Okumu, and even though he wasn't initially on the list of those who will be in the mediation thing, he ended up being the central man. When every other international leader had gone away, he was now the person, the go-to person around.
He was there.
He was the main person everywhere. And it's just astonishing to see how God can use his people if we decide to raise up our hands and use us to become the influencers and the change, the ones that bring the change. And here we are. The history has it that the election held peacefully.
Yeah.
And what we have today, we can trace back to that time. Would you say, Michael, that those who were, I want to read a place from your book, and you make your comment on this, because I was wondering on this. You see, you said this before, you said that many who fought in the struggle against apartheid have failed to stand up to the widespread corruption within our current government. That sometimes it's easier to be a voice when you have something as big as that, and because you sided with one group, it's so easy. So let's say you are in Nigeria. I take Nigeria as an example. So you were behind the opposition party when they were fighting to get elected because you didn't like many of the things going wrong with the present regime, and now that opposition party has come in and they have their own bits of things they're doing, and sometimes you're not as loud as you were with the other group. How do you see the church's reaction to this present situation in South Africa? And I'm trying to talk in the context of Africa because this happens everywhere. Yeah. And how do we position ourselves to be non-partisan and be focused on the kingdom of God, his purpose in the nation, and not just lining up with either our race, people who come from our ethnic group, people who come from our political alignment? How do we do that?
I think it is very difficult because we are political creatures in some ways. We do tend to form alliances with people and get into groups. But I think you've mentioned already prayer. I think the huge thing in the moment is to pray for the leaders on the different sides of this issue. The Cyril Ramaphosa and others on one side, and Muzi Maimane on the other. I think it starts there, and I think the church then has to raise up her voice and her standard loud enough to be heard. See, part of the problem the church has witnessed is it's inaudible. You can't hear it. Mm-hmm. And it's invisible. You can't see it. Now, the greatness of Desmond Tutu was that he was both audible and visible. And when he spoke, the government saw and the government heard. We need something like that coming through the church. And so I think there's there is a need, and some of us have formed a forum of leaders from around the country that we're hoping is going to be able to stand up and speak up, and which will have the in due time the ability to be heard and to be seen, because somehow or other government has to hear. And that's a great thing. And the church represents a lot of people.
Why do you think you were heard back then? Why did you think Michael Cassidy had a voice back then?
Well, yeah.
No, because we can learn from that. Why do you think?
I don't think it was so much my voice, to be really honest. I think it was the voice. It was the voice of others. It was the voice it was the voice of the players who were in this negotiation, hearing each other. Buthelezi was hearing de Klerk. De Klerk was hearing Buthelezi.
I hear that, Michael, and I know you're not the type that likes to put the spotlight on yourself, but I would think, and you might correct me on this, they seem to have been, in all your interaction with leadership, as I read this book, your focus was Christ. You said somewhere that whether he was an atheist or a Muslim, you always want to leave there with, I want to pray for you in Jesus' name. You were concerned about the spiritual well-being of every leader you went to. There seemed to be a disinterest in pushing an agenda, except for pushing one thing, being a voice for the masses, caring for righteousness, caring for things to go as they should go. Don't you think that's gave the integrity of a man makes his voice loud. Wouldn't you say so?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what role or influence I played. I think my big thing was bringing Okumu in. But I think that it is true that over the many years of what AE had done, people knew we had some credibility because we had sought for justice for so long, spoken into the issues for so long. We weren't a prominent voice like Desmond, so that we got our name in the newspapers every second day. It was a quieter, more muted voice, but it actually built up confidence in the country. So that, like, for example, when we called the Colombia Lodge meetings to happen, people came.
That's what I mean by a voice.
Yeah. So yeah, we had built something up. A kind of a quiet voice.
Yeah, but because the question, people would say, well, I can't say anything, I can't influence anything. But I'm just trying for us to learn from what you had. Now, we're trying to wind this down now. What would you say God is saying to Africa today? I mean, it's a big question. If you look around, I know you would say South Africa, but if you look around the continent, what do you sense in your heart the Lord is saying? Where are we? What do you think the Lord is saying?
Well, I think it's wonderful that Africa is basically a theistic continent. It's not atheistic. You don't find many atheists in Africa.
That's true.
It's a theistic continent. And so people are fairly readily believers. And I think we need to challenge Africa and its governments to grasp, especially the governments, to grasp that they are not autonomous. Autonomous is a big and complicated word, but it basically means, running your own show. Autos in Greek means self, nomos means law. You're a law unto yourself, you're autos nomos, autonomous. And we need to be telling the states all across Africa that they are not autonomous, that Romans 13 says that the state is God's servant for good of all. It's God's servant. They are not autonomous. They're not a law unto themselves. They can't just shout the odds and do whatever they want to. There's finally a transcendent point of reference.
Amen.
And that needs to be listened to and obeyed. And most African countries, nominally that is believed. So you can have prayer breakfasts and all that sort of thing in Kenya, Nigeria, and so forth. Leaders will come. But it's not really acted on. What are the divine principles that need to hold us and need to bring us to united action? So, my challenge to the the church around Africa, of course, is first of all prayer. It's secondly for each individual to do their bit where they are. Thirdly, for leadership people to challenge government and to make a difference to government. And for government to grasp that if they want the blessing of God on a country, they've got to walk the ways of the Lord. That means justice, that means integrity, that means fair play, that means caring for all. It is a vast question because it includes the whole economic system apart from anything else. That you can't just have a pure capitalism in Africa that will save it. It needs mixed economies where you have a strong free enterprise is allowed in the countries, and then strong social benefits for the poor and the marginalized. You've just got to have that. And the rich have got to be willing to be highly taxed, I believe, in these countries. And you mustn't undermine business. You mustn't let confidence be lost in business. South Africa's got to restore confidence in overseas investors to say it's worth investing in South Africa. That mustn't be lost. And then the church must move out in evangelism. Like in the Wesleyan revival of the 18th century, Wesley and those guys, they were great preachers. It moved out in evangelism. It started in prayer, moved out in evangelism, and then it called on the people in the corridors of power to make changes. So Wilberforce in the British Parliament, Shaftesbury, the Clapham Group, all of those, they were calling for change. They were calling for prison reform. They were calling, and it happened, for 84,000 children to be brought out of the mines, and they were. They were calling for education reform, medical, hospital, and finally the abolition of slavery, which was achieved in 1832. So, you know, it's not going to be a one-man savior for the situation. It's requiring a whole movement of the body of Christ in each country seeing they're important. But we do need our people at the top, the Cyril Ramaphosa's of this world. They really need to be giving the lead strong and clear. That will encourage the church as well, of course. But the church must be part of encouraging them.
That's good. Thank you so much, Michael. We'll be rounding up here. Thank you so much for your time. We've been talking to Michael Cassidy, the author of the book, Footprints in the African Sand. Michael is the founder of African Enterprise, an evangelistic movement which works in different parts of Africa, and he is also a Christian statesman. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time. I really enjoyed talking with you. God bless you.
Thank you.
Hi there, thanks for watching this video. I want you to do 4 things before you go away. Number 1, click on the subscribe button here, and then number 2, click on the bell button. That will allow you to get an alert every time we post a new video, and we're posting new videos, edifying interviews and edifying words every week. Number 3, please leave a comment on that. Let us know what you think, whether good or bad. And lastly, share this channel with your friends. Let them know that something is happening here. Thank you for joining us. Keep coming back.